Take a look at this map. This is Ethiopia, the second most populous nation in Africa, and for much of the past decade, one of the continent's fastest growing economies. But Ethiopia has a problem that shapes every part of its future. It has no coastline. That means no access to the sea. You see, almost everything Ethiopia imports arrives through someone else's port, and almost everything it exports leaves the same way, through a gate Ethiopia does not control. That gate is Djibouti. Today, more than 90% of Ethiopia's seaborne trade passes through Djibouti's ports. Keeping that lifeline open costs Ethiopia an estimated $1 to $2 billion every year in port services, transit fees, and logistics. For years, this was treated as an uncomfortable reality, but a manageable one. Well, that changed in October 2023.
Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed.
Standing before Ethiopia's parliament, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed delivered a speech that sent shockwaves across the Horn of Africa. He described Ethiopia as, quote, a prisoner of geography. He argued that a country expected to approach 150 million people in the coming decade could not indefinitely remain landlocked. Then he went further. He spoke of Ethiopia's need for a permanent outlet to the Red Sea, calling maritime access a natural necessity rather than a policy choice. And he warned that if the issue could not be resolved peacefully, future generations would be forced to address it themselves. Across the region, the message landed hard. To Ethiopia's neighbors, this did not sound like an abstract economic theory. It sounded like the return of a dangerous question, one the Horn of Africa thought it had already answered. What emerged was not a single alliance on paper, but a growing regional alignment, shaped by a shared fear of Ethiopia's push toward the sea. And that brings us to the question at the center of this story. What happens if Ethiopia cannot get what it wants? Is this the opening move in a confrontation that could destabilize the Horn of Africa and threaten a trade corridor carrying over a tenth of global commerce? For much of the 20th century, Ethiopia was not landlocked. Its access to the Red Sea ran through the ports of Assab and Massawa, located along what is today Eritrea's coastline. After World War II, and especially following Eritrea's federation with Ethiopia in 1952, these ports operated under Ethiopian sovereignty. Ethiopian cargo moved through them. Ethiopian ships docked there. The Red Sea functioned as Ethiopia's maritime outlet to the world. Well, that arrangement would not last. Eritrea's union with Ethiopia was not voluntary. In 1952, the territory was federated with Ethiopia under a United Nations brokered settlement intended to preserve Eritreans' autonomy within the Ethiopian crown. But over the following decade, Emperor Haile Selassie steadily dismantled that autonomy, dissolving Eritrea's parliament, suppressing political parties, and centralizing authority in Addis Ababa. In 1962, the federation was formally ended. Eritrea was absorbed as a province of Ethiopia. What followed was a war that would define the Horn of Africa for a generation. Beginning in the early 1960s and lasting for 3 decades, Eritrean liberation movements fought a war for independence. By 1991, Eritrean forces had achieved a decisive military victory. 2 years later, in 1993, a United Nations supervised referendum was held. 99.8% of Eritrean voters chose independence. Ethiopia, under a new post-death government, recognized the outcome. With that recognition, Ethiopia became landlocked. The loss was sudden in geopolitical terms. Overnight, a country that had relied on Red Sea ports for generations found itself without a coastline and without sovereign control over any maritime outlet. But there was a detail that would linger quietly in Ethiopian political memory. There was no national referendum inside Ethiopia on the consequences of Eritrean independence. No parliamentary vote specifically addressing the loss of sea access and its economic implications. At the time, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Meles Zenawi adopted a deliberately pragmatic approach. He argued that access to ports was an economic matter, not a territorial one. something that could be purchased on the market rather than owned outright. The assumption was straightforward. Ethiopia and Eritrea had fought side by side to overthrow the Derg. Their ruling movements were allied. Trade would continue. Ethiopian goods would still flow through Assab and Massawa. Landlocked status, while inconvenient, was manageable. For a brief moment, that logic held. And then, roughly 5 years later, it collapsed. In 1998, Ethiopia and Eritrea went to war. The immediate trigger was a border dispute over a small dusty town called Badme. But beneath that flashpoint lay deeper tensions. Eritrea's introduction of its own currency, disputes over trade and payment systems, and disagreements over port usage had begun to strain the fragile economic relationship that followed independence. The interdependence Ethiopia's leaders had counted on was no longer stabilizing the peace. It was fueling resentment. The fighting lasted roughly 2 years. By the time a ceasefire was reached in 2000, tens of thousands of people were dead. Ethiopian forces regained significant territory on the battlefield, but the strategic picture was unchanged. Ethiopia had not regained a port, it had not secured a coastline, and most importantly, it had not solved its access to the sea. What the war did make clear though was something else. Reliance on Eritrea was no longer viable, so Ethiopia turned south to Djibouti. Djibouti is a small country, home to fewer than 1 million people, but its geography gives it outsized power. It sits at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow gateway between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, directly across from Yemen. One of the world's most important maritime choke points runs past its shores. Over time, Djibouti built its economy around that position as a port state, a logistic hub, and a gateway between Africa and global trade, and Ethiopia became its largest customer. By the early 2020s, over 90% of Ethiopia's seaborne trade was moving through Djibouti's ports. For a country of more than 125 million people, that meant almost its entire import-export economy depended on a single corridor, managed by a single foreign government. The costs were immense. Ethiopia pays an estimated $1 to $2 billion every single year in port services, transit fees, and logistic expenses. But this was more than a bill, it was leverage. Djibouti holds significant pricing power. Congestion in its port slows Ethiopian trade. Disruptions in Djibouti ripple directly into Ethiopia's economy, and any prolonged instability along that corridor would rapidly disrupt supply chains across the country. All of this was happening as global powers moved decisively into the same narrow strip of coastline. You see, Djibouti now hosts one of the most concentrated foreign military presence in the world. The United States operates Camp Lemonnier, its only permanent military base in Africa. China established its first overseas military facility there in 2017. France, Japan, and other partners maintain military forces and logistic hubs alongside them. Flags from the world's major powers line the Red Sea, and Ethiopia, a regional heavyweight and one of Africa's oldest states, has no seat at that table. In 2020, Saudi Arabia launched the Council of Red Sea and Gulf of Aden states, bringing together coastal countries including Djibouti, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and Jordan. Ethiopia, despite its size and economic dependence on the corridor, was not invited. From Ethiopia's perspective, this was quite troubling. It was paying billions to access a sea it had no voice in governing, while powerful states worked together to shape the rules without it. To Ethiopian leaders, this felt like encirclement, and increasingly, it felt unsustainable, something they believed had to change. When Abiy Ahmed became Prime Minister in 2018, he inherited a country under strain. Years of protests had exposed deep ethnic tensions. Millions had been displaced by communal violence. The economy was growing, but unevenly. weighed down by debt, foreign exchange shortages, and rising expectations. And beneath it all, a strategic anxiety never fully disappeared: Ethiopia's isolation from the sea. At first, Abiy focused on peace. Within months of taking office, he signed a landmark agreement with Eritrea, formally ending the 2-decade Cold War that followed their border conflict. Borders reopened, flights resumed. The moment was historic. Abiy was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
The Nobel Peace Prize for 2019 to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali.
For a brief moment, there was optimism that peace might in fact bring about deeper cooperation, including renewed commercial access to Eritrean ports. Well, that optimism did not last. Relations with Eritrea cooled again, then fractured. The Tigray War, which erupted in 2020, drew Ethiopian and Eritrean forces into a temporary military alliance against Tigrayan forces. But when the fighting ended with the Pretoria Agreement in 2022, Eritrea was excluded from the negotiations altogether. The wartime partnership dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed. By late 2023, Abiy's focus had shifted decisively. Seeing how the politics of the Red Sea was shaping up, Abiy told his parliament that if peaceful solutions failed, future generations would be forced to secure Ethiopia's rightful access to the Red Sea themselves. The wording mattered. It was no longer the language of logistics or trade, it was existential, and to Ethiopia's neighbors, it sounded like a warning. Well, 3 months later, Abiy acted. In January 2024, Ethiopia signed a memorandum of understanding with Somaliland, the self-governing region that declared independence from Somalia in 1991, but for decades remained diplomatically isolated. Under the reported terms of the MOU, Ethiopia would receive long-term access to a stretch of coastline near the port of Bela, with the possibility of developing maritime and naval facilities. In return, Addis Ababa signaled its intention to move toward formal recognition of Somaliland's statehood. For Ethiopia, it was a workaround, a path to the sea that avoided direct confrontation with Eritrea. Somaliland was willing, but for Somalia, the deal crossed a red line. Mogadishu considers Somaliland an inseparable part of Somali territory. At the time of this agreement, no UN member state had formally recognized Somaliland's independence. By negotiating directly with Hargeisa, Somaliland's capital, and bypassing Somalia's federal government, Ethiopia was treating a Somali region as if it were a foreign state. The response was swift. Somalia expelled Ethiopia's ambassador and recalled its own envoy from Addis Ababa. President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud declared the agreement null and void, warning that Somalia would defend its sovereignty if Ethiopia moved forward. Regional backing followed. The Arab League issued statements affirming Somalia's territorial integrity. Turkey and Qatar, both deeply invested in Somalia's security and reconstruction, voiced concern. Even militant groups inside Somalia attempted to exploit the crisis rhetorically, folding it into their propaganda. Ethiopia had secured a possible gateway to the sea, but it had also ignited a diplomatic firestorm, one that placed it on a collision course, not just with Somalia, but with the fragile balance of power across the Horn of Africa. And Somalia was only the beginning. The reaction from Eritrea would prove even more dangerous. No country views Ethiopia's renewed push toward the Red Sea with more alarm than Eritrea. For Eritrea, the coastline is not just geography, it is sovereignty. Control of its Red Sea territory was central to the decades-long struggle for independence. The ports of Massawa and Assab, which Ethiopia lost after Eritrea's independence, sit firmly on Eritrean soil, under Eritrean control, protected by Eritrean forces. So when Abiy Ahmed spoke of Ethiopia's natural outlet to the Red Sea, Eritreans did not hear an abstract argument about trade. They heard a statement that appeared to blur the line between access and entitlement. And in Eritrea's view, to question borders that were settled through war, referendum, and international recognition, the reaction was swift. Groups of Eritrean scholars and policy analysts published detailed responses to Abiy's remarks, warning that his rhetoric risked undermining Eritrea's sovereignty and destabilizing an already fragile region. They argued that access to the sea could be negotiated economically, but territorial implication, even rhetorical, crossed a red line. Eritrea's government went even further. Senior officials accused Ethiopia's leadership of reviving dangerous ideas that had fueled past conflict. Public statements emphasized that Eritrea would defend its sovereignty if threatened, a message intended less as provocation than as deterrence. And Eritrea's deterrence is real. Despite a population estimated at 3 to 4 million people, Eritrea maintains one of the most heavily militarized states in Africa. Military service is compulsory and effectively open-ended. Independent estimates suggest well over 100,000 troops remain under arms, supported by large reserves. The country has structured its political system around constant readiness, a legacy of its independence, war, and subsequent conflicts. Geography makes that posture even more volatile. The port of Assab lies roughly 60 kilometers from the Ethiopian border. Any attempt to alter the status quo would unfold across terrain both sides know intimately. And what makes the current moment especially dangerous is how recent cooperation has given way to renewed distrust. Just a few years before Abiy's Red Sea speech, Ethiopian and Eritrean forces had been fighting on the same side during the Tigray War. Eritrean troops crossed into northern Ethiopia to support the federal government against Tigrayrian forces, an extraordinary alignment between former enemies. That alignment did not survive the war. After the 2022 Pretoria Agreement, Eritrea found itself excluded from the negotiations that ended the conflict. Relations cooled sharply. From Asmara's perspective, Ethiopia was reopening questions that Eritrea considers settled by blood, ballots, and borders. And Eritrea made one thing clear. On this issue, there would be no compromise. But Eritrea was not the only country drawing a red line here. Now, to understand Egypt's role in this story, you have to start with the Nile. Roughly 85% of the water that reaches Egypt originates in the Ethiopian highlands, flowing primarily through the Blue Nile and its tributaries. For Egypt, this river is not just an economic resource, it is the backbone of the country's survival, supplying drinking water, sustaining agriculture, and supporting a population of more than 100 million people in one of the world's driest climates. That dependence shapes everything Egypt does. So, when Ethiopia began building the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Africa's largest hydroelectric project, alarm bells rang in Cairo. The dam is designed to generate electricity, not irrigation, but by storing and regulating the Blue Nile, it gives Ethiopia far greater influence over the river's seasonal flows. Egyptian leaders have repeatedly described this as an existential risk. For more than a decade, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan have cycled through negotiations over the dam. Egypt has pushed for binding guarantees on water releases, especially during droughts. Ethiopia, on the other hand, has insisted on its sovereign right to develop its resources and rejected external control. Despite interim frameworks, including a 2015 Declaration of Principles, the talks have repeatedly stalled, leaving the core dispute unresolved. Now, place the Red Sea on top of that unresolved conflict. Among Egyptian security analysts, Ethiopia's push for maritime access is increasingly viewed as a second front in the same strategic struggle. The concern is not that Ethiopia seeks confrontation, but that a stronger, more self-sufficient Ethiopia becomes harder to pressure on the Nile. A landlocked Ethiopia is constrained. An Ethiopia with reliable port access and naval reach is not. From Cairo's perspective, leverage matters. As a result, Egypt has worked to deepen security and diplomatic ties along the Red Sea corridor. Over the past several years, It has expanded cooperation with coastal states through naval exercises, port visits, and defense agreements, particularly with Eritrea and Djibouti. These partnerships stop short of permanent basing, but they increase Egypt's presence and access in the very maritime space Ethiopia depends on. At the same time, regional alignments have been tightening. In late 2024, leaders from Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia held high-level meetings focused on security cooperation, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Egypt has also expanded its security engagement with Somalia's federal government, presenting itself as a guarantor of Somali sovereignty at a moment of heightened tension with Addis Ababa. Seen from Addis Ababa, the pattern is hard to miss. Eritrea sits to the north, Somalia lies to the east, Sudan, often aligned with Egypt on Nile issues, though not consistently, borders Ethiopia to the west. Across this arc, Egypt has strengthened relationships with nearly every state surrounding Ethiopia. Ethiopian officials rarely use the word openly, but in private and increasingly in public rhetoric, the perception is clear. This feels like encirclement. Not a single alliance, not a formal pact, but a growing web of pressure designed to limit Ethiopia's room to maneuver on both the Nile and the Red Sea. And that perception is now shaping Ethiopia's choices. But even Egypt is not the final piece of this puzzle. The Horn of Africa has become a theater of strategic competition, and the most valuable pieces on the board are ports. Across the region, Gulf states have poured money and influence into maritime infrastructure as strategy. The United Arab Emirates has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the port of Berbera in Somaliland, largely through its state-linked port operator, DP World. The project was designed to turn Berbera into a modern logistics hub, one capable of serving not just Somaliland but landlocked neighbors, including Ethiopia. Turkey has taken a different approach. In Mogadishu, it operates Camp Tuksum, one of Turkey's largest overseas military training bases. Separately, a Turkish firm manages the city's port under a long-term concession. Together, these investments anchor Ankara's security and economic footprint in Somalia. Qatar has also explored port and infrastructure projects along Somalia's coast, though several of these plans have stalled amid political and security challenges. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia has moved to expand its diplomatic and security influence along the Red Sea, deepening engagement with coastal states such as Sudan and Eritrea, while positioning itself as a central player in Red Sea security discussions. Now, these investments converge around a single geographic reality: the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This narrow passage links the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. In a typical year, around 6 to 7 million barrels of oil per day transit these waters. Between 12 and 15% of global trade and a substantial share of global container traffic moving between Asia and Europe depends on this corridor and the Red Sea routes it feeds. The fragility of that system was exposed in late 2023 when Houthi attacks on commercial shipping off the coast of Yemen forced many shipping companies to reroute vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. The detour added 10 to 14 days to journeys and drove up costs by 20 to 40%, rippling through global supply chains. For the Gulf states, the lesson was clear: they need stable partners, reliable ports, and assured access on both sides of the strait. This is where Ethiopia enters the picture and reshuffles the board. The UAE has cultivated close ties with Addis Ababa, seeing Ethiopia as a long-term economic partner and a critical source of port traffic for Berbera. Turkey and Qatar, by contrast, have aligned firmly with Somalia's federal government, which views Ethiopia's Somaliland agreement as a direct threat to Somali sovereignty. Saudi Arabia has strengthened relations with Egypt and Eritrea, both wary of Ethiopia's growing regional ambitions. The result is not a single bloc, but a web of overlapping interests. Gulf rivalries now intersect with African disputes over borders, ports, and sovereignty. Each port concession, each security partnership, each diplomatic signal subtly shifts the balance. not just within the Horn of Africa, but across the Red Sea system that links Africa, the Middle East, and global trade. So what began as Ethiopia's search for an outlet to the sea has drawn in some of the world's most powerful regional actors. And the consequences of that competition reach far beyond the Horn itself. Between 10 and 15% of global trade moves each year through the Red Sea and the shipping corridors it connects, a flow valued at well over $1 trillion annually. Container ships carrying electronics and manufactured goods from Asia to Europe. Tankers move oil and gas from the Gulf to global markets. Grain, pharmaceuticals, and industrial inputs all pass through the same narrow waters. This is why the Horn of Africa matters far beyond the region. A serious conflict here would not stay local. If fighting disrupted Djibouti's ports, supply chains would be severely disrupted across East Africa. If insecurity made Red Sea routes unsafe for commercial shipping, companies would once again divert vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to journeys and driving up costs by 20 to 40%, as they did during the shipping crisis of late 2023. And if the Bab el-Mandeb Strait were threatened, global energy markets would feel it almost immediately. That vulnerability explains why external powers are so invested in stability in the Horn. It is not about local politics alone. It is about keeping the arteries of global trade open. But the spillover risks do not end at shipping lanes alone. You see, the Horn of Africa sits along two of the world's most dangerous migration corridors, tracked closely by International Organization for Migration. The eastern route runs from Ethiopia and Somalia across the Gulf of Aden to Yemen, then north towards Saudi Arabia, a route marked by exploitation, violence, and mass casualties. The central Mediterranean route moves north through Sudan and Libya toward Europe, one of the deadliest migration paths on earth. Instability pushes people onto these routes. Conflict creates refugees. Economic collapse creates migrants, and as flows increase, smuggling networks expand to meet demand. Sudan, already engulfed in civil war, functions as a major transit hub for movement toward Libya and the Sahel. Niger remains a critical choke point for West African migration, and it borders Nigeria directly. Pressure in the Horn does not end here. It travels, moving north and west through fragile states and already strained borders. There is also a security dimension that cannot be ignored. Militant groups operate across these same corridors. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda-linked networks across the Sahel, Islamic State West Africa province, and Boko Haram around the Lake Chad basin. These groups are not formally allied, but they exploit the same dynamics: weak governance, porous borders, arms flows, and human displacement. Large-scale conflict in the Horn of Africa would risk creating exactly the kind of instability these networks thrive on. Arms circulation would increase, state capacity would be stretched thinner, ungoverned spaces would expand. And once that happens, the consequences do not respect borders. What began as a dispute over ports and access to the sea now carries implications for global trade, migration, and security. From Europe's supply chain to Nigeria's borders, this is no longer just Ethiopia's problem. So what is the end game here? What can Ethiopia do about this situation? Despite the heated rhetoric, full sovereignty over a foreign port is widely seen by analysts as unrealistic. Any attempt to seize Eritrean territory would almost certainly trigger a devastating war. Annexing land in Somaliland would provoke international condemnation and regional conflict. Ethiopian officials have repeatedly denied seeking territorial conquest, and the strategic cost of doing so would be enormous. So, the more plausible objective lies between ownership and dependence. Ethiopia's leadership appears to be searching for arrangements that deliver predictable, long-term maritime access without necessarily changing borders. One option is long-term leasing, similar to the reported decades-long access Ethiopia sought under its memorandum with Somaliland. Another is joint port development or management, an approach Ethiopia has explored in discussions around Tajura in Djibouti. A third is equity participation. Ethiopia is reported to hold a minority stake in the port of Berbera, and it maintains access agreements with Sudan for alternative trade corridors. There is also the naval dimension. Ethiopia has announced plans to rebuild its navy after decades without one. For that, it would need sovereign territory, only basing or docking rights secured through agreements that allow a limited maritime presence without territorial acquisition. Such arrangements are common globally, but politically sensitive in the Horn of Africa. Even Abiy Ahmed's recent tone suggests awareness of these limits. While his language has been maximalist, he has repeatedly emphasized peaceful resolution, dialogue, and international norms, and has publicly signaled openness to negotiations rather than force. That points to a gap between rhetoric aimed at domestic urgencies and outcomes Ethiopia may actually accept. And for Ethiopia's neighbors, the dilemma cuts the other way. Can Eritrea, Somalia, and Egypt offer Ethiopia enough access to diffuse the crisis without undermining their own sovereignty, security, or leverage? Because if Ethiopia remains permanently locked out of the sea, the pressure will not disappear. And if the region offers nothing, the rhetoric will only harden. What happens next will depend on whether the Horn of Africa chooses managed compromise or allows geography, history, and mistrust to push it toward confrontation. Yes, Ethiopia needs the sea. The question is, what Ethiopia is willing to risk and what its neighbors are willing to lose to get us there.